Hey everybody, I'm Emma and I'm here with Jenna, who's going to
Hello.
present on archives basics tonight. So I kind of struggled with the title. We had originally called it like new archives, and it's basically like if you are literally just dropped into an archive, what do you do? The archive can be new, it can be old, it can have, other previous custodians, and I'll let Jenna kind of talk about the scope in a minute. But first things first, just a couple of housekeeping items. We will do a Q&A at the end, so please just save your questions till the very end. We don't have a chat, so you will have to unmute to ask your question. And then we are recording this. I put it on our YouTube channel, but I will also email out everybody a link to the recording later this week. And then we do have over 100 people in the meeting tonight in the webinar, so please just stay muted with your microphone off until it comes time for the Q&A. Um, so Backlog is the name of my company. We're putting on this webinar. Jen has been working with me for 3 or 4 years now. We're based in St. Louis, but we travel all across the United States to work with different archives, and we work with everybody from corporate archives to nonprofits to small historical societies. And I'm Emma. I founded Backlog in 2021. Before that, I worked as a university archivist. And from here, I'm going to hand it over to Jenna.
Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm a museum archivist. I'm located in New England. You also might see my cat Ellie, who has decided that now is a great time to start committing crimes in the apartment after being just asleep until the call started. So I have often been in positions where I just kind of I get dropped into a situation in an archive where there's been an archivist before, but maybe there hasn't, maybe there's been a gap. Or the archivist also had a bunch of other duties. So that's really been my whole career. I've never reported to an archivist. I've always just kind of been dealing with the archives on my own. So hopefully I can impart some I don't know if we call it wisdom, but relate some experiences that you might find useful. So yeah, next slide, we'll get started. So, um, what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to try to keep it fairly general, but I am kind of assuming that uh, you're coming into an archive that has historical collections and perhaps institutional records, but also you might be, a nonprofit, just a nonprofit that doesn't preserve historical records, but you want to maintain your own organizational records because maybe you're like a 100-year-old nonprofit. Or you could be other types of institution. So hopefully everything that I say is adaptable and you can just disregard the stuff that's not related to your institution because I think hopefully some of the advice will be valuable to very different types of situations. So I want to talk about like what do you do before you even start processing? Because you might have the urge to see a box of stuff and say, I'm going to turn that into a collection right now. And start organizing stuff and making the room. I'm imagining just the archives room or the archives closet, as often happens, trying to organize it and make it look neat. But there are other steps that you can take first that in the long run will benefit the foundations that you're building. So want to talk about how to start turning that closet, that room, that multiple rooms of archival material into an actual repository that functions and can be accessed by the public. So making an inventory is going to be a big part of this guidance, but I also want to talk about getting a holistic view of the collection and how to plan for moving forward so that you're building a policy and procedure framework so that this never happens again. Because maybe you're a volunteer and if you take a break from volunteering or stop volunteering, or if you're a part-time person or a grant-funded person, you don't want there to be a huge gap in knowledge if you're no longer there. You want the next person to come in and say, okay, there are foundations and they don't have to start over. Next slide, please. So I think the most important thing to do is when you get into your space, triage your big problems. So this is a picture of a slide carousel, and the slides have been stored in it, which is not great for them. And you might be able to kind of tell because of how they've been stored, they haven't been supported so that the cardboard has started to split, and so the slide film is just popping right out. So if you see boxes that are actively crumbling or, or are harming the materials because maybe they're acidic or there's dye running out of, like the ink on the boxes or something, replace that stuff immediately. And anything with mold or pest infestations, isolate those materials immediately and immediately reach out to specialists. And I've done webinars on dealing with strange damage and identifying what the damage is. So I'm going to be doing some plugs for stuff I've talked about in other webinars. So get on the Backlog YouTube page. Uh, and so at some point you will want to do a full assessment of the housing quality and stability of all your materials, and you might want to, buy metal edged boxes. But like that can come later. You don't need to do that. That doesn't need to be the first thing that you do. Just do a bit of triage, address things that are big problems as you are going through and inventorying. And you can always make notes that you want to come back to something later, but you don't need to do that when you're first starting out and still learning what the collection is. Next slide, please. So whatever your space is and whatever type of shelving you have, standardize what you're calling everything. I recommend doing coordinates so that when, in your database or your spreadsheet or whatever, you have, it's in this building, this room, this aisle or area, this this vertical unit, this horizontal shelf, whatever you call them. As long as you're consistent, it does not matter. There aren't really best practices on like the best way to number things. You just have to decide what you're going to do and label your shelves and so that and your goal is that a person coming in without knowledge can see the labels on the shelves and figure out how to find stuff. If they've got, if they've got your catalog or a list with locations, they could find a box. I always say if I get hit by a bus, if if you are not there to direct someone, you can't be the only expert. Like institutional knowledge is incredibly important, but it is important to be shared. So you might experiment with the best way to number things, but figure it out before you start entering locations into your database or your collections management system or your spreadsheet or list or whatever, because it's really annoying to have to change it later. So just decide what you're going to do and be consistent. Next slide, please. So when you're going and doing your inventory, um, when you're recording the content of what's in the box, also record the size and type of box because you might need to be calculating linear feet or cubic feet for later. So it's just really useful to be able to say, like, if you've got a spreadsheet, oh, okay, we've got, 120 Hollander boxes and 400 record cartons. We can do the math on that. Or we've got a bunch of stuff that has to go flat. That's, 2.5 feet long. Uh, and as you're going through, like you might want to make some more housing changes. If you've got materials that don't take up the whole box, you can put them into slimmer boxes because that supports them better, and then you gain a little bit of shelf space. But if you're just doing inventory, you don't have to be doing this big housing survey, but that's just a thing that might be useful, especially if you are having some struggles with space, as in this image, which is one of my past archives. And if you don't see any preservation concerns, note that in your inventory as well. So you might say like, oh, the metal edges are popping off this box. Should replace that later. Things like that. So the things that were not serious enough to triage, but that you might want to get to eventually, start noting that stuff when you do your inventory. Next slide, please. So there may have been inventories that existed already. So don't waste that information in that past work. Try to refer to what has been done before, if anything has been done before, and try to cross-reference, like, oh yeah, this box was mentioned in the inventory that was done 30 years ago, or oh, I was going through files and yes, we have a deed of gift for this thing. Uh, any information that you can kind of collate in your new inventory that will maybe eventually make it into a collections database or whatever kind of system you use to keep track of your collections. Do that. Just make any information collation will be incredibly useful later. Um, so it might take a while to get inside the head of the person who did that inventory before you. and figure out what their logic was, but it's usually worth doing. Next slide, please. So I mentioned, note when you have deeds of gift. And again, I'm assuming that you're starting with nothing. You might be coming in and there are already some provenance files and deeds of gift and things. So if you are able to find any materials on donations or transfers from other institutions or purchases or other origins of items in your collection, start keeping track of that stuff. And this is more something like if you do have historical records, like if you're just doing institutional records, this part probably won't be as important, but it might be useful to keep track of like which office or which person transferred the records to the archives. That's the sort of, I guess, analogous thing. So start building a provenance or an object file. So each collection would have a file with information about, the donor or the purchase, any research that's been done, any conservation that's been done. These files are not themselves an archival collection, and they're not really for public access, and you don't need to keep track of those in your collections database. But they're vital to establishing ownership and authenticity. So when you think about um, a researcher's coming to use your collections, and they're going to want to know that you purchased this from a reputable auction house, or this was donated by a descendant of the person who created it, and you have that chain of custody, so you know that the document is legitimate. And of course, collect institutional knowledge too about how something got to your archives or why it's there. But people's memories are not perfect. I was thinking about this. People's memories aren't perfect when they're like in court and they've witnessed something. So they also, imagine them trying to remember like why a box is in a certain place or where it is, if it's been a while. So don't depend too much on something that somebody happens to remember. Um, and it's okay if you don't have an answer. Next slide, please. So also decide what's your archives and what isn't. I have been dealing with materials that are all mixed together by subject. So you might have primary sources like documents and photographs mixed together with notes and photocopies of articles and printouts from the internet, all kind of organized because that's how someone was doing research in the collection. They were kind of building their own research collection around the primary sources. So I'm kind of having to pick that apart and identify, okay, so the original materials came from this family. And then there are all of these sort of institutional records that were made of the, in doing research on them. So, keep your primary sources primary. So and don't mix maintain your fonts, your collections, the origins, things that have the same origin, stay together and you don't mix them up. I also did a webinar on respect du fond and original order. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, go look at that one. And you might find that collections have been mixed together in the past. So maybe you have a ton of photos and documents related to one historic building in your town. And it's all been mixed together, and you can't tell, they're all primary sources, but you can't tell what came from where. It's an artificial collection. You might not be able to pick it apart. You might not have deeds of gift for every single item. So in cases like that, you just have to be explicit about that in the finding aid. You can say, this is an artificial collection that was combined by, a researcher, a past archivist, past curator. So the researcher knows not to assume relationships between the different materials. So, hopefully you will be able to identify this group of materials came from one place, this group of materials came from another place. But it's also very likely that you will not be able to do that. So you might end up with several groups of information. So if you are an organization that preserves historical materials, you might have your historical special collections, your institutional archives of the history of your organization, so like your meeting minutes, your publications, photographs of events, things like that. And then you might also have a library of non-rare reference material, whether that is a library of, books about history or research about the type of work that you do in your nonprofit, those materials, it doesn't really make sense for those to be in the archives. So that sort of thing can just be a library where people are just referring to things. So one of the things that I did in my current position was I established our curatorial library. So these are books that are not rare. They're the books that like we're buying as they come out. And these are for people who are doing research for an exhibit or for an article or researching a particular object. They can use these materials and check them out. And they're separate from, the rare books, the archival material, the historical material. So making those separations can be a little bit confusing for people who have never worked that way before. But in the long run, it will make your information management much easier. Next slide, please. So numbering collections is kind of a bugbear of like what's the best way to do it? How do we convey the right information in the number? How do we be consistent with it? Are there best practices? As far as I can tell, no. So you might have some numbering systems already for sometimes things are numbered by like just by box, by collection. Sometimes each folder or each item is numbered. It really depends on if the person who did this work is trained as an archivist or a museum person or a librarian. There are like different ways of thinking about the individual versus the aggregate. So try to see what's already there, and see if though there's a particular logic or any guidance to how those numbers were assigned and with whether any conflict with each other. I have been dealing with a collection of like 600 photographs that was cataloged twice with completely different numbers, and it's not like one to one, like they're in a different order. And one of them has records with individual photos and one doesn't. So I'm just going by descriptions. And it's taken multiple people months, and we've all lost our minds. So see what's up with your collection numbering before you start just throwing numbers out there. And if you establish a new system, you don't necessarily have to renumber all of the old stuff. You can have outliers. Like I'm finding there are a bunch of things in our collection that were assigned numbers that are kind of close to how the museum objects were numbered. And I'm probably not going to renumber all of that old stuff. There are just going to be some weird outliers. They're still going to have records in our collections management system, and they're just going to be a little bit weird. But I've written a memo for going forward. We're going to number things in this way according to these rules. And that was something that our registrar, so who handles the museum objects, had also done when she established a new numbering system that better reflects the order in which things arrived, the year in which things arrived, and the number of items in a particular accession. So she's not going back and renumbering the 10,000 things that were numbered before, but just establishing a new practice going forward. So just make sure that your new practice doesn't conflict with your old practice, um, and just write it down. Write down the rules. And you also might have separate numbers for an accession because that describes the transaction, and a collection that actually describes the items. So the types of information you're collecting for an accession is like a bit about the stuff, but also a lot about the donor, the date, the method of acquisition. And then the collection record is going to be about the actual stuff. So you might have two separate numbers to describe kind of the same materials, but it's really the materials and the business transaction of getting them. But you also might not. So it really depends on your system and your particular environment. And as you learn your collection, you might discover stuff that goes together that you didn't realize went together. Like, oh, actually, these two boxes are part of the same donation. So definitely do your inventory and get to know your collection before you start trying to move it into collections and number everything. Next slide, please. So I'm just gonna imagine I'm like reaching through the screen and I'm like holding your hands. Please inventory your media. So often, like even if you have an inventory already, it will be like box of DVDs. Even in a finding aid, sometimes it's like a series that just says media. But take the time and inventory your media. Because we know how to take care of paper, like paper and photographs, and yes, they can grow mold or get discolored, but media are really fragile and they have many inherent vices and they're all different. So different types of like acetate that break down or off gas, or even, CDs and DVDs, it's digital information, but sometimes they just stop working or they can get scratched or broken. So they require a lot more care than I think we are often prepared to give them. So in your inventory, note not only the content of what is on everything that you encounter, but the carrier. Is it a reel-to-reel? Is it a VHS tape? Is it an 8-track tape? Or some sort of digital information. And that will also help you realize like if something has been digitized previously. So like I had a bunch of oral histories that were on cassette tapes and then realized, oh, a little while later, they were put on DAT tapes, which is digital information, but it's a tiny cassette tape. But then they were also on CDs or DVDs. So then I could just put them onto um, put them into our digital storage. I can put them in Preservica. I don't have to then go get our oral histories all re-digitized like it was actually done in the past. But if I had just been like, oh, tapes, take them off to get converted, I wouldn't have known that and I would have wasted a bunch of money. So learn what you have as best you can. And it'll be so much easier to get research and digitization work done if you just know roughly what you have, even if you don't have the equipment for viewing or listening to it just yet. But work with your neighboring institutions to share equipment for obsolete media. Maybe you can get together with some other area groups because someone has a TV with a VCR or an old boombox, and you can all kind of listen to your stuff together. It can be a great like community building experience. But every single repository does not need to have a full media lab. You can definitely find ways to share. And you don't have to do all the digitization yourself, and that's something that will probably come later, which I'll get to later on. But you don't have to build a full media lab in your new archive in order to digitize all this stuff. There you have other options.
Wait a minute.
And if you do get things digitized, do not throw it out afterwards. Because digital information is fragile too. Find out what storage conditions these media need. It's often cold storage. Um, but just don't throw it out because it would be really terrible if then you have some sort of data loss and you've getting rid of the masters. It's the same as, we scan a photo and put it online. We don't then throw out the archival photo. So I think it's more tempting with media because it's plastic and it's clunky usually and it takes up a lot of room. But don't throw it out. Next slide, please. So, in addition to me rambling at you, some other resources that you might want to look at, a couple of books. Inventory and Cultural Heritage Collections is one that I found quite useful. Um, and then there's a book by Christina Zeman, who's an archivist. She wrote a book that used to be called The Lone Arranger. And it's now called Alone in the Stacks, Succeeding as a Solo Archivist. So there's this new edition out. That's published by the Society of American Archivists. And that was very useful to me when I was starting out. Like I'm also kind of speaking with the assumption that you might be on your own in encountering your new archive. If you're not, that's great. But I feel like so many of us are just sort of trapped in basements with a bunch of stuff, and we're like, what do we do with this? How do we keep track of it? How do people use it? So those are two resources that I found useful, but also get involved with cultural heritage groups in your area or that have similar types of materials as you, your library associations in your region, and get to know your other institutions in your area. So I happen to work in a town that we're a historic house museum. There's a historical society. There's a historical Athenaeum. And then there are also, the government records, and there's a university. So we're all just in this one town. So see who else is out there. And if you are in an area that doesn't have other institutions, look for discussion groups or message boards and email lists via the Society of American Archivists or the American Association for State and Local History. and like, or any other groups that you can find with similar interests and similar concerns and similar problems to solve. Next slide, please. So if you've gotten, imagine you've gotten to know your collection, a task that takes always much longer than anyone thinks it does. And describe what's in the collection and what is the type of research or the community that the community needs, which it intends to serve. So we want to meet these types of community needs. Like, is it genealogy? Is it local history? Is it just internal records management? What is in our collection and what do we intend to do with it? And how does it fit in with our mission as an organization? So start there and think about, well, how do we want to expand this scope because this collection doesn't quite serve those needs? Do we need to narrow the scope because we've got a bunch of stuff that isn't serving our mission? And then confirm this with the governance of your organization and turn it into a collections management policy. So in the future, you'll be able to say, this is the type of stuff we collect. This is the stuff that we don't. Here's why we collect it. Here are our processes for acquiring new things, so that you will be able to be more thoughtful and intentional in deciding what comes into your repository in the future. Next slide, please. So archives are meant to be used. So you can't, I mean, I guess you could, but you can't just inventory all of your stuff and that's it. So think about how people are actually going to be able to use it. So regardless of whether you're digitizing things, piggyback on the web presence of your organization. So and granted, and again, this is assuming that you have stuff for the public. So if you do not have public collections, like you're an institutional archive for, say, a nonprofit or a business, maybe you're looking at like your company intranet or your staff newsletter or something, some sort of announcement, to let people know that, like, hey, we have archives. These are the types of things that we have. So, but imagining that, you have you're a historical association of some kind and you have a website, at least say like we have list what collections that you have, or say that we are establishing our archives. This is sort of the stuff that we have. This is kind of what we're thinking about, our timeline for access, or contact this person if you have questions. Um, and decide, whether it's you and other staff in the building, what's your space capacity and your time capacity for hosting researchers, and also what kind of security do you feel that you need for your materials based on kind of your building structure, the value of materials, how well you can monitor researchers. Because maybe you're the first couple of years you're able to scan stuff and send it to people more or less on demand, but you really can't have people come in. You can do a bit of research for people and give them an answer, but you don't have a table for them to work at. So decide what your access policy is for right now, and then you can always revisit that as you build capacity. In your whatever announcement, or whether it's a web page or newsletter or whatever, provide some sort of form or contact info and establish expectations for a response. Say, like, because it all depends on how often you are working. You might be part-time, you might have other duties, you might have 10,000 feet of collections that you are trying to inventory. So you might say, like, you can expect a response within 3 to 5 business days, or a week, or 2 weeks. But let people know what you're working with for staff time, so that they're not expecting you to rush and that you don't feel that you have to rush. And also, just something that I have found to be useful: encourage people to give you an email address. I know, like, obviously talking on the phone is much more personal, but I can't send you photos through the phone. So if someone leaves me a message saying that they're looking for a particular image, and then I have to call them back and tell them whether I have it or not, and then if I do have a scan for them, I might need to send them some sort of permissions form if they're going to publish it, and also the actual image. But then it's like I've got to call them, and then they've got to call me back to get an email address, and it's absurd. So really encourage people to provide an email address. You might also, that might be their primary form of communication. You might also be talking to them on the phone a lot, but being able to send written information and links and scans is much easier to do that from the beginning rather than having to go back and forth. And also I always, 'cause I'm pulled away from my desk, people leave me messages and it's like, oh, if I had caught them, or if this was an asynchronous conversation, I would have been able to tell them, give them an answer much more quickly. Um, so anyway, we're dealing with often physical materials or digital materials, and we can't send them through the phone. Next slide, please. So, in looking past this first deluge of stuff and dealing with the stuff, um, you will eventually start to see a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, in that you can start planning for a less chaotic future. So start thinking about what kind of budget you're going to need, whether that's, for supplies or staff or equipment. Um, any sort of disaster preparation that might be possible. I mean, even if it is even something as simple as, if there is a flood or some sort of disaster, what's my phone tree? Who do I call first? Who do I expect them to call? Gather up the phone numbers of whoever you would need to be talking to in the case of different types of emergencies, at the very least. A full disaster plan can be really, really daunting, but at least having something to turn to when you're in like freeze mode, like, oh no, there's a leak. Just having something you'd be like, okay, what do I do? And you can just turn to that instead of having to come up with what you need to do in the moment, will make things much easier. You might want to start thinking about what do you want to process? What do you want to digitize? What kind of conversion do you want to do for your AV or your obsolete media, which you have inventoried and which you know exactly what you have? And are there services that you want to use to do that work? How do you want to improve your access? Is that through digitization? Is that through having really detailed collection descriptions or finding aids? Do you want to pursue grants to pay for this work, for processing or projects or programs, or paying interns or part-time staff people or full-time staff people, or recruiting volunteers? What kind of outreach do you want to do to researchers or community groups that you think might want to use your materials? Whether that's school groups or historical interest groups, or maybe just groups within your organization of stakeholders who might want to know more about the history of your organization. And I guess the other bugbear, I think, in information management is your records management. If you are collecting institutional records, has that been really haphazard in the past? How do you want to record the history of your institution moving forward? And it's a huge task, and it requires the input and stakeholding, I guess, of pretty much everybody in your organization. So that's something to always keep an eye, to point an eye toward for the future. But it's definitely not a day one task. Next slide, please. So you also, whether you have historical materials or not, as you're getting to know your collection and getting to know the organization, make timelines. This is just something that I found really useful, of whether it's organizational histories, like we moved into this building on this date, or local history or key dates related to your specific historical collections. And that can be really useful when you're trying to describe your collections, especially if they're quite chaotic, to kind of contextualize materials and date them. Because you might know, oh, this wing was added to this building in this date. And in this photo, the wing is not there. So these people, or like maybe the people are dressed a certain way, um, this photo must be from before this year. Or this particular person became the president of our organization in this year, but at this photo of the annual meeting, it is a different person speaking, so it must not be between these 2 years. Um, and you might be able to make this into some sort of interactive timeline or an exhibit later. So it's good research to have, and it really will really help with any sort of ready reference that you might be providing. Next slide, please. And this is the less exciting than like, oh, what year was this wing built type of history, but document the history of what you are doing to make the archives happen. So whatever interventions you're making with collections, like I pulled all of the photocopies out of this collection. any changes you make or new policies. Even if you just want to every day do a bullet point journal of what you did in establishing the archives, that would be useful to future staff. Um, just some sort of record, or maybe you're writing monthly reports. Maybe those reports don't go to anybody else in the organization, but you have a record of here's what the archives was like, and here's what I am making it into. And also build out your policy and procedure framework. So this is our collection policy, these are our access policies, our copyright and production and reproduction policies. This is how we digitize things. This is how we number things. The All of that framework defines the archive's scope of collections and the scope of its services and the scope of its operations. So build that out so you could, I mean, even if it's not literally a binder of how the archives works, it could be, a folder of digital documents. But having that sort of manual as a core of information that exists, that other people can access, that is not just in your head, is really useful because, archives how do I put this? Preserve things throughout time continuously, but not necessarily with a continuity of management. And so losing that continuity of, a grant runs out, a volunteer stops working with an organization, there are budget cuts, so there's not a staff person running the archives anymore. Those lapses in continuity create management problems and information losses. So you can try to prevent those same losses from happening in the future by really documenting everything that you're doing and building this policy and procedure framework. Next slide, or that might be my last slide. Yes. So hopefully that's no surprises. There wasn't a surprise final slide.
So our next webinar, really quickly, we'll do Q&A in a second. Our next webinar is on record life cycle. So basically, how do things get from like working files to the archives, kind of looking at the whole thing holistically. And then Jenna will be back in January and we'll talk about appraisal, acquisition, and accessioning and kind of like what are the differences and like what is the sequence. I don't have this one or the next couple ones up on the website yet. I will by the time I email out this recording. But you just go to our website, backlog-archivist.com/webinars, and that's where you sign up, or you will be able to later this week. So I've asked Jenna to tackle this one because these things are kind of at the beginning of like an archives process or whatever, and they kind of get conflated. And Jenna can bring her signature explanations and examples to this topic. And then we're going to talk about metadata one-on-one, like why do we collect metadata? What is it? What is it? All of those things later in January. And then Brittany will do archival loans. So kind of talking about like what's the paperwork around it? Why do we do these? And we've been working with that with a lot of institutions. Like, oh my goodness, we have this guy's stuff. We've had this car for like 50 years. Is it ours yet? And maybe they should have documented that. So kind of just talking about all the logistics around that. So next we're at, oh, this is our YouTube channel. It's just at Backlog Archivists, and all of our previous things. And then the one of the webinars that Jenna mentioned about like what is respective fonts is called Provenance in Original Order. And so it's in there. And I think, when did you do that? Last spring?
Yeah, it was within the past couple months, I
Okay.
think.
Yeah. And then we also did one on we've done like a lot of kind of intro topics in the last like 18 months that you can find on here. And we have a playlist called Archives 101. Okay, and now we'll go to questions. So if you want to raise your hand or unmute, oh, we've already got one. And we'll, just answer these to the best of our ability within a reasonable time frame. So Perry, if you want to unmute and fire away.
Uh, yeah, and first off, thank you all for doing what you do. I even have gone so far as to get an archive certification from a master's program, and I still learn more from your videos than I've gotten in some of my classes. You never seem to really get past the theory and into the hands-on, tell me how to do this stuff in those classes. So, to that end, I wanted to ask, so if you're in an institution that say we're not going to be able to afford a Preservica or an archive space or, a Past Perfect or something like that, what is the best way to get around, what is a good uniform metadata schema that you can use if you are not going to be able to use SAA or Dublin Core, or what is just a bare bones, this is acceptable within the professional realm. There's always this fear that you feel like you're doing something amateurish if you don't have, these are the key pieces of metadata that you need. Can you
Yeah,
offer
so
advice?
yeah. And so I mean you can use Dublin core fields just in a spreadsheet. Each column is a Dublin core field. And you can describe collections that way. I love a spreadsheet. I used to sit when I worked at a university and I would have students work for me. I would say, even if they're not going to become historians, they're going to learn Excel. They're going to learn how spreadsheets work, and how to organize information that way. Uh, so you can do everything in a spreadsheet. And also the nice thing about spreadsheets is that the information becomes manipulatable. So if you are eventually able to put it into a database, you can convert it to a comma separated format or a CSV file. And oftentimes you can import that data into a database of some kind. But using something simple like a spreadsheet keeps you from being locked in to like, oh, I've got this in like Microsoft Access and I can't get the data back out. And it's a lot more user friendly than like learning a new database system. Um, so that would be my advice. Using spreadsheets, and maybe you have different tabs for different types of materials. I
Mhm.
know I have a huge archives inventory that I started, on day one of my job, and it
Mhm.
started with here's one section. Every single box or item that I encounter on a shelf, and then another tab for another section, and then I have tabs for things like all of the AV item by item, and
Mhm.
a list of all of the collections numbers. And then you can link to stuff too. So I can link to like we do have finding aids online in this location, or just what the like where the collection is cataloged. So you can always link to stuff that's in your like shared drive or hard drives or something like that.
Mhm.
I've also used Airtable. Um, I've just been
Okay.
using the free version as a sort of relational database to keep track of some of my digital preservation. But overall, I think just picking a metadata schema like Dublin Core or something, that's like that is something that is open source and free to use.
Uh-huh.
And just using those fields in a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Really,
So Jenna,
really reassuring to hear you say that spreadsheet is okay.
Oh yeah.
and we have a webinar on Dublin Core that goes into each of the different fields. And you would actually be really, really surprised like how many I've met corporate archivists who still use spreadsheets because just because they work for somewhere with money doesn't mean that they will allocate or give money to archives.
Mhm.
And like it's sad, but it's true. And so not everywhere like is using like like archive space or something. And then sometimes there are like free versions of software, but yeah, a spreadsheet's a really good place to start. And like what Jenna said, you can then use that later if you do get software. Lisa,
Hi, thanks so much. Uh, my question is sort of about cataloging and arranging. When our archive was first started back in the 70s, it was sort of the first collection was named one,
Mhm.
and it went on from there. And so we have like an extensive number of items that are under like number 36.
Mhm.
And then someone changed to naming things by year. So we go from 36 to then we've got like 2018, 2019, 20 and so on. So I've recently received some items that really belong with like the collection that's like numbered 30. Like
Okay.
it's stuff that's come in that is part of that person's material. It's a
Okay.
continuation of images that really are part of that series.
Mhm.
Should I tack them on to number 30, or should I start them naming them number 2025 or 2026? It'll be
Yeah.
for January. What's the best
So
practice to do there?
that's a really good example of like sometimes you have multiple numbers for so you might have two different accessions, one from 2018, one from 2025, but one isn't, but they're two accruals of the same collection.
Well,
Uh,
but one was originally from this one was from the 1970s when they were doing a different numbering. So the
okay,
original donor and the original creator of all of the objects in the collection is numbered like 30. So
okay,
I've got more of
okay.
those. Do I just tack them on to 30 or do I start calling them 2026?
So you could, so it, and depending on how your record keeping goes, you might have like this is an accession 2025, 2026, whatever, and then you might add it to the finding aid for collection 30. Um,
Mm,
because the transaction and the objects are like can be separate records. Um,
okay.
or you could always say, we're adding this to collection 30, but it's like 30 point something. The way sometimes a collection will have multiple series, so it's collection 30, series 1, subseries 5. So you could
Right.
do like or like 30B or something. But whatever you decide to do, just be consistent with it and write out like what how you want to do it. And then so that it's consistent every time. Um, but I completely lost my train of thought. And then in your finding aid, you can say these materials, list them out, arrived as a separate accrual at a
Okay.
later date.
Okay. Thank you so much. I
You're
really,
welcome.
really appreciate it. We've really been wrestling with this. It's just me and a volunteer. So thank
Yeah.
you. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Vanessa, we're ready for you.
Hi, I was wondering if you have an idea what is the percentage of things that are in WorldCat that are being cataloged for different archives and what is not cataloged and it would not be found unless you go to the archive itself or you look at the archive website.
I don't know a percentage. I imagine it's quite low.
Okay.
Because I know, I mean, for a record to be in WorldCat, it has to be a MARC record, and a lot of times, archives might be writing finding aids, but even if they're, encoded in EAD and they're online somewhere, that doesn't translate to having a WorldCat record. So I mean, like, what do they call it? Archive Grid is run by WorldCat, and so that captures some archival materials, but
Yeah.
not a lot. I know that there has been movement in the past couple of years in the United States anyway, to build a national finding aid network so that you don't have to turn to WorldCat. You can turn to an archive-specific source to do research and find archival materials.
Yeah.
That effort was funded by the IMLS, which no longer has any funds. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that project. Um, but I imagine, yeah, a lot of stuff is not on WorldCat.
Yeah, because I catalog records for LPs for cataloging for when I was a student for these music archives. So they didn't exist, so I had to make every single record but
Yeah.
individually. And I was just wondering how many more things are online that on Worka that are archived and what things is not archived because then it's just easier to look for geographically and contact the archive itself and ask them for finding aids to search what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think it is a lot of
Okay, thank
the,
you
the
so
best yeah, the
much.
best way to find materials is to look for the institution, really.
Okay, that is good to know. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Nick.
Um, First, thank you again. Thank you again for the presentation. Um, I'm working for a state government bureau, and we have a collection of institutional records and historical items that we want to document and catalog. And one of the major milestones for that is digitizing them.
Mhm.
And part of that is coming up with a good system of naming conventions for the digital files. I was wondering, I was wondering if you had any advice for digitizing records and creating good file names for
Mhm.
digitized records.
Yeah, I think including whatever the collection number is, or and any depending on how they're organized, series number, maybe a little bit of verbal metadata if that helps. So it might say like, like name of the collection or an abbreviated name of the collection. And also just a couple of random tips. If things, you might have record group 75 underscore, maybe a year or a person underscore, and then you're just numbering, use leading zeros. Otherwise, your things will not sort correctly. So you might have 001, 002, up to 010 for 10. Because that was not done at my current place of work. And so things are, it's just point 0.1, point 0.2. But also don't put uh, special characters or periods in the file name itself. People love to just like use like a point but that is how a computer reads what the file name is. So it's going to think that the file name is point one point JPEG instead of just a JPEG, for example. I had a really hard time once trying to upload a group of materials into Preservica, and I was like, why isn't this working? So I was just uploading them from our shared drive, and there was an apostrophe because it was just the title of the document was in the file name because I wasn't gonna like rename 400 files beforehand. 'Cause they already had names. So yeah, don't use special characters, avoid spaces. Underscores and hyphens are great for separating out the different parts. And whatever you do decide, write a memo about it. And so everyone can follow uh, that same method going forward.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
This will be our last question, so we end before 6 p.m. Debbie? Debbie, if you're there, you just need to unmute. And I think you can do it by just hitting your space bar.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Jenna, thank you. You said that once we digitize something, we should not throw out the original.
Right.
Are you talking about old, obsolete forms of video as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
And those things will continue to degrade over time. So you digitize a VHS now and you digitize a VHS in 10 years, the color will probably not be as good or it might not be as clear. But it's so easy to lose digital files, for them to be corrupted or to lose physically lose a hard drive, or for a hard drive to fail. Um, just in the same way, like it's very easy for a building to burn down and you lose all of your papers. It's good to just keep all of the different forms of the media, and not just the digital file.
that kind of segues into a second question, but I don't know if I have time to ask it. It's related.
Yeah, go ahead.
If someone gives you their research or maybe an oral interview on a USB drive, what do you do with those?
So it kind of depends on what kind of storage you have, like if you have a shared drive or cloud storage or whatever.
Yes.
Definitely, I think it's a good idea, whatever external media you have, whether it's USB drives, hard drives, whatever, have some sort of numbering system for those and a spreadsheet that says like these are the types of files that are on each of these external media. But then also make copies. There's like this is the concept of lots of copies keep stuff safe when it comes to digital materials. So whether that's you have things in a Google Drive or a Dropbox or a digital preservation management system like Preservica or a shared drive, just make sure that you have additional copies and it's clear where the copies are, and also keep all of your physical hard drives and USB sticks together.
So, okay, so you're recommending numbering each USB because it's very hard. You can't put a label on there to say what it is on it. So how do you manage that? You put it like create a separate inventory for those
I've
items?
seen people just write on a piece of paper and tape it on. It's just so you don't
Yeah.
like lose it in a drawer, just the way you wouldn't lose a house key and you know which house key it is. And so it's
Yeah.
kind of like doing those practical like shortcuts.
Yeah. We're finding that they're coming in more and more frequently because
Yeah.
the technology's there, and rather than handing you a book with photocopies, it's just easier to give you a USB.
Yeah.
Thank you, Debbie, for your
Yep.
question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
thanks everybody for coming this evening. I will email out a link to this recording later this week. If you want to check out it beforehand, we'll put it on the backlog YouTube. And again, Jenna will be back in January for the appraisal. What was it? Appraisal, acquisition, and accession. So thank you everybody for joining us.
Thanks, guys.